The United States today is one of the largest and most influential countries in the world, a nation stretching from the Atlantic to the Pacific, made up of 50 states that span mountains, plains, deserts, and coastlines. With a land area of roughly 9.8 million square kilometers, making it the third largest country on Earth, behind only to Russia and Canada. But this wasn't always the case. When the United States became a country, it was a fragile republic of 13 former colonies clustered along the Atlantic coast, bordered by enormous stretches of largely ungoverned land. So how did they acquire almost an entire continent and turn that land into 50 states? After the Treaty of Paris in 1783, the United States faced the challenge of turning 13 independent-minded colonies into a functioning nation. The Articles of Confederation proved too weak. Congress couldn't tax, regulate trade, or maintain order. Shays' Rebellion in 1786, where debt-burdened farmers attacked courthouses, exposed just how unstable the new republic was. At the same time, independence created a new problem: massive overlapping Western land claims. Several original states claimed huge sections of this new territory based on old colonial charters. Smaller states protested, fearing the larger ones would become too powerful. To preserve national unity, the states began ceding their Western claims to Congress. This led to the creation of the Northwest Territory and Southwest Territory, governed under the process defined in the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, a law that established how federally controlled territories could become states once they reached a set population and created a republican government. Delegates then met in Philadelphia and produced the U.S. Constitution, creating a stronger federal government with a president, courts, and a two-house Congress. It was ratified in 1788, and it went into effect in 1789 with George Washington as the first president. Early leaders like Alexander Hamilton helped build the Treasury, while the State Department, Supreme Court, and other institutions set crucial precedents in foreign policy and economic management. Yet unity remained fragile. The 1790s saw America's first political parties: Alexander Hamilton's Federalists, favoring strong central government and closer ties with Britain, and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, promoting states' rights, agrarian ideals, and sympathy for France. Their rivalry shaped early national policy. Meanwhile, new states entered the Union: Vermont in 1791, after it had broken away from conflicting New York and New Hampshire claims; Kentucky in 1792, after breaking away from Virginia, which was too far away to govern it effectively; and Tennessee in 1796, split off from North Carolina after settlers there demanded protection, stable laws, and access to federal support. The move of the capital to Washington, D.C., around 1800 symbolized a government becoming more permanent and organized. Thomas Jefferson's election marked the first peaceful transfer of power between rival political parties. His defining achievement came in 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, in which the United States bought 828,000 square miles of land from Napoleon's France for $15 million, roughly 4 cents per acre. The deal was made possible because France, facing war in Europe and a costly rebellion in Haiti, could no longer defend or develop its North American territory. The purchase doubled the country's size and opened the way for the Lewis and Clark expedition, led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, to explore the newly acquired lands and establish relations with native nations. Meanwhile, the nation continued adding states from older, established regions of the Republic. Ohio entered the Union in 1803 as settlers flooded into the Northwest Territory, and Louisiana followed in 1812 after years of rapid growth around New Orleans and the lower Mississippi. But expansion brought strain. British warships seized American sailors at sea, while native nations resisted U.S. encroachment. On the frontier, Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa built a powerful native confederation, quietly supported by British agents in Canada. British pressure at sea and native resistance on land pushed the young republic into a new crisis. The United States declared war on Britain in what became the War of 1812, a conflict fought across the Great Lakes, the Canadian frontier, and the Gulf Coast. Early American attempts to invade Canada failed, but the tide began to turn after the U.S. secured control of Lake Erie in 1813. That same year, Tecumseh was killed in battle, and with his death, the native confederation he built collapsed, weakening coordinated resistance across the Northwest Territory. In the South, General Andrew Jackson defeated the Red Stick Creek faction at Horseshoe Bend, forcing enormous land cessions and opening vast new territory to white settlement. But national morale fell sharply in 1814 when British forces marched into Washington, D.C., burning the Capitol and several government buildings. The U.S. recovered, repelling the British at Fort McHenry, inspiring Francis Scott Key, and winning a dramatic victory at New Orleans in early 1815. The Treaty of Ghent ended the war without changing borders, but the psychological effect was enormous. Americans emerged more confident, and migration into Western territories surged. With these population shifts came more states. Indiana in 1816, Mississippi in 1817, Illinois in 1818, and Alabama in 1819. Each built from rapidly growing frontier settlements shaped by agriculture, trade routes, and federal land policy. Far to the northwest, the Oregon Country entered joint occupation in 1818, with the United States and Britain agreeing to share authority over the vast territory. At the same time, the United States finally settled one of its longest-running diplomatic uncertainties, its border with Spain. Ever since the Louisiana Purchase, no one had fully agreed where U.S. land ended and Spanish territory began. The issue was resolved in the Adams-Onis Treaty of 1819. Spain ceded Florida to the United States, and both nations drew a firm boundary running along the Gulf Coast, up the Sabine River, across the Red and Arkansas rivers, and out toward the Pacific. Ratified in 1821, the treaty gave the U.S. a clear southwestern border. This rapid growth soon produced a political crisis. Missouri's request to enter the Union as a slave state threatened the delicate balance between free and slave states. Congress responded with the Missouri Compromise of 1820, an attempt to preserve the fragile balance between free and slave states. Missouri was admitted as a slave state, while Maine entered the Union as a free state. Maine had long been part of Massachusetts, but it was geographically separated and often politically neglected. As its population grew in the early 1800s, residents pushed for self-government, frustrated that laws and decisions affecting them were being made hundreds of miles away in Boston. The compromise also drew a line across the Louisiana Purchase, limiting the future expansion of slavery north of that boundary. It was never meant to be permanent, but it diffused an immediate crisis and kept the Union intact. Farther southwest, Arkansas developed as settlers pushed down the Mississippi River Valley. Once its population reached congressional requirements, Arkansas entered the Union in 1836 as another slave state. Meanwhile, the Great Lakes frontier surged with migrants moving west along new canal routes. This growth transformed the Michigan Territory, but its admission was delayed by a bitter boundary dispute with Ohio, the Toledo War. Congress resolved it by awarding the disputed strip to Ohio and compensating Michigan with the Upper Peninsula. With the dispute settled, Michigan became a state in 1837. These developments unfolded as Andrew Jackson, now president, reshaped national policy. Elected in 1828, Jackson championed Western expansion and the interests of frontier settlers. His administration passed the Indian Removal Act of 1830, forcing native nations east of the Mississippi to relocate westward. That outward pressure quickly reached the lands to the southwest, and no region felt its impact more sharply than Texas. Originally part of Mexico after its independence from Spain, the region was sparsely populated and difficult for Mexico City to control. To strengthen the frontier, Mexico invited U.S. settlers, known as Anglo-Americans, to move in during the 1820s under the impresario system, granting large land parcels to men like Stephen F. Austin, who agreed to bring in hundreds of families. But as thousands of settlers arrived, cultural and political tensions exploded. Many newcomers ignored Mexican laws, resisted converting to Catholicism, and brought enslaved people into a country that was trying to restrict slavery. Mexico attempted to tighten control with the law of April 6, 1830, banning further U.S. immigration and placing military garrisons in the region. Instead of restoring order, the move pushed settlers toward open rebellion. By 1835, fighting broke out in what became the Texas Revolution. Texan forces seized garrisons and declared independence in March 1836. Mexico's president, General Antonio López de Santa Anna, launched a brutal counteroffensive, capturing the Alamo and executing prisoners at Goliad. But his campaign collapsed after he was defeated and captured at the Battle of San Jacinto, where Texan troops led by Sam Houston forced him to sign agreements ending the war. With that victory, Texas became an independent nation, the Republic of Texas, a sovereign country with its own president, currency, debt, foreign policy, and frequent border skirmishes. But independence brought problems. Conflicts with Comanche nations on the frontier, a nearly bankrupt treasury, and fear that Mexico might reinvade at any time. The United States had long hoped to acquire Texas, but doing so risked war with Mexico and threatened to upset the delicate balance between free and slave states. However, the 1840s brought a rising belief in manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was destined to expand across the continent, and growing concern that Britain might form ties with the young Texan Republic. These pressures made annexation politically irresistible. In 1845, the U.S. Congress approved the annexation of Texas. The moment Texas accepted the offer, it entered the Union as a state. But annexation instantly reignited border disputes with Mexico, particularly over whether the Texas border ended at the Nueces River, Mexico's claim, or the Rio Grande, the U.S. claim. This disagreement, combined with deeper U.S. ambitions in the Southwest, set the stage for the Mexican-American War. When U.S. troops entered the contested zone, Mexico saw it as an invasion and attacked. President Polk declared that American blood had been shed on American soil, and Congress moved to war. In the north, General Zachary Taylor led U.S. forces across the disputed zone between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. Early clashes at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma pushed Mexican troops south, allowing Taylor's army to advance into northern Mexico. By late 1846, U.S. forces had captured Monterrey, and in early 1847, they faced a massive counterattack led by Santa Anna at Buena Vista. Despite being outnumbered, Taylor's army repelled repeated assaults and held its position. After failing to break the American line and facing supply problems, Santa Anna withdrew his forces south, abandoning the northern campaign. These victories secured the northern frontier and forced Mexico to divert troops that could not be used elsewhere in the war. Farther west, the United States moved quickly to seize Mexico's most distant provinces. In 1846, General Stephen W. Kearny led the Army of the West out of Fort Leavenworth, marching across the Great Plains and into New Mexico. His force occupied Santa Fe without resistance, effectively ending Mexican authority in the region and securing the overland route to the Pacific. Kearny then split his command. One column, led by Colonel Alexander Doniphan, turned south into northern Mexico, defeating Mexican forces at El Bracido and at the Battle of Sacramento, opening the road to Chihuahua. Kearny himself pushed west toward California, but events along the Pacific coast were already unfolding before his arrival. In July 1846, U.S. naval forces seized Monterey, the capital of Alta California. Further south, American ships took San Diego, while fighting around Los Angeles briefly reversed U.S. control before it was reasserted. After a brutal desert march that severely reduced his force, Kearny reached California in late 1846 and joined these operations. U.S. forces then defeated the remaining Mexican resistance and secured Los Angeles in early 1847, bringing California firmly under American control. The decisive campaign came from the south. In 1847, General Winfield Scott launched one of the boldest operations in U.S. military history, landing an American army by sea at Veracruz. From there, U.S. forces marched inland, fighting their way through fortified positions at Cerro Gordo and advancing toward the Mexican heartland. After a series of hard battles, Scott's army reached the Valley of Mexico. In September 1847, U.S. troops entered and occupied Mexico City itself, effectively breaking organized Mexican resistance. With its capital occupied and its armies defeated on every front, Mexico was forced to negotiate. The war formally ended in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Mexico recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas and ceded a vast northern territory and much of the Southwest to the United States, in exchange for $15 million in the assumption of Mexican debts. 5 years later, the southern border was finalized through the Gadsden Purchase, in which the United States paid $10 million for a strip of land south of the Gila River, securing a practical route for a southern railroad. Meanwhile, another long-standing frontier territory completed its transition into statehood. Florida, ceded by Spain in the Adams-Onis Treaty back in 1819, had spent decades developing its settlements, stabilizing its territorial government, and absorbing waves of migration after the Seminole Wars. With its population finally large enough, Florida entered the Union in 1845, securing full U.S. control of the southeastern coast. In the north, migration surged into the upper Mississippi Valley. Iowa had grown rapidly since the 1830s, especially after the Black Hawk War removed the last major native claims in the region. Farmland filled quickly, towns multiplied along river routes, and by the mid-1840s, Iowa easily met Congress's requirements for statehood, becoming a state in 1846. Just north of Iowa, Wisconsin followed a similar trajectory. Its economy blossomed through Great Lakes shipping, timber production, and a rising population of German and Scandinavian immigrants. By 1848, its territorial government had matured and its population surpassed federal thresholds, allowing Wisconsin to enter the Union as the next state. Congress then organized newly acquired and frontier lands into territories, established temporary governments, and set population thresholds that allowed residents to draft constitutions and apply for admission. The West saw California's sudden rise. In 1850, it became the only state in U.S. history to leap directly from unorganized territory to statehood. The catalyst was the 1848 gold rush. Within months of gold being discovered at Sutter's Mill, tens of thousands of migrants poured in from across the world. Miners from Latin America, merchants from the East Coast, sailors who abandoned their ships in San Francisco Bay, and thousands more traveling overland on hastily formed routes. Towns ballooned into cities, lawlessness spread, and there was no functioning territorial government to manage the chaos. Taking matters into their own hands, local leaders drafted a constitution that banned slavery and applied directly for statehood. Congress accepted, bringing California into the Union as a free state under the Compromise of 1850, a deal that temporarily delayed but did not resolve the national conflict over slavery. Farther east, the lands that would become Minnesota had followed a steadier path. Settlers from New England, Canada, and Scandinavia built farming communities along the Mississippi River and the northern forests, blending frontier expansion with strong cultural ties to the upper Midwest. The region had long been part of the Northwest Territory, and once its population reached federal requirements, Congress approved its transition to statehood. Minnesota joined the Union in 1858, adding another free state to the rapidly growing Northern Bloc. Just 1 year later, in 1859, Oregon became the next new star on the flag. Its story was shaped by the Oregon Trail, the legendary route that carried tens of thousands of settlers westward through the Great Plains and over the Rocky Mountains. The region's earlier joint occupation with Britain had ended peacefully with an 1846 treaty that set the boundary at the 49th parallel. After years of territorial governance and a mix of farming settlements, timber operations, and port towns, Oregon's population was stable enough and organized enough to join as a state. Meanwhile, the Great Plains became the center of a national crisis. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened Kansas territory to settlement under popular sovereignty, meaning locals would vote on whether slavery would be legal. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers flooded into the region, turning the territory into a battleground. Towns were raided, elections were rigged, and violence escalated into a small-scale civil war known as Bleeding Kansas. After years of conflict, a free state constitution finally prevailed, and Kansas entered the Union in 1861, literally the same year the Civil War erupted. For decades, the United States had been held together by a fragile political compromise. Every time a free state entered the Union, a slave state usually followed, keeping power in the Senate balanced. But the enormous new territories gained after the Mexican-American War shattered that system. Suddenly, the nation had to decide whether slavery would expand into the West, and neither side was willing to back down. California's admission as a free state in 1850 broke the pattern, and the violence of Bleeding Kansas proved that the issue of expansion had turned into open conflict. The breaking point came in 1860, when Abraham Lincoln won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state. To Southern politicians, this proved that the federal government was now controlled by a Northern majority that would block slavery's expansion forever. One by one, Southern states voted to leave the Union, and by early 1861, they had formed the Confederate States of America. Only after this political collapse did the country slide into open war. Not every slave state immediately chose a side. Missouri and Kentucky found themselves trapped between North and South, geographically, politically, and socially. Both permitted slavery, yet both were deeply divided, with strong Unionist sentiment and powerful Southern ties. In Missouri, rival pro-Union and pro-Confederate governments claimed legitimacy at the same time, plunging the state into vicious internal warfare defined by guerrilla violence and shifting loyalties. Kentucky's position was just as fragile. Sitting astride vital rivers and rail routes, it declared neutrality at first, knowing that any decision risked tearing the state apart. In the end, Kentucky remained in the Union, even as tens of thousands of its citizens fought for the Confederacy. Maryland, on the other hand, its geography made its decision uniquely dangerous. If it left the Union, Washington, D.C. would have been surrounded by Confederate territory, cutting off the federal government at the very start of the war. When violence erupted in Baltimore in April 1861 and secessionist sentiment surged, Lincoln moved quickly. Federal troops occupied key rail lines in cities, habeas corpus was suspended, and pro-secession lawmakers were arrested before they could force a vote. Maryland never formally chose a side. It was held in the Union by force, even as thousands of its citizens fought for both armies. Indian Territory faced a different kind of fracture. The region, created decades earlier as a destination for forced native removal, was home to the 5 civilized tribes, each with its own government, laws, and territory. When the Civil War erupted, the United States abruptly withdrew its troops from the area, leaving native nations exposed. With Confederate forces advancing from Texas and Union armies focused elsewhere, Indian Territory was left to navigate the war largely on its own. Faced with invasion, the 5 civilized nations signed formal treaties with the Confederacy in 1861. These treaties promised protection, representation in the Confederate Congress, and respect for tribal sovereignty. Promises that were only partially honored. The Cherokee Nation was the major exception in unity. It split internally, producing rival governments and armies, with factions fighting for both the Union and the Confederacy. Creek and Seminole communities also fractured, with pro-Union refugees fleeing north into Kansas, while Confederate-aligned governments remained in the territory. Chickasaw and Choctaw leadership remained largely aligned with the Confederacy throughout the war. Indian Territory became a major internal battlefield, with repeated raids, scorched farmland, and collapsing food supplies. When the war ended, the consequences were severe. Washington treated Confederate-aligned tribes as defeated enemies, including those with internal Union factions, forcing new treaties that stripped away millions of acres, dismantled existing governments, and opened the land to railroads and non-native settlement. Indian Territory had fought, suffered, and fractured, yet emerged with less sovereignty than before. In Virginia, the eastern plantations and political elite aligned with the Confederacy, while the mountainous western counties had a very different reality. Small farms dominated the region, enslaved labor was rare, and economic ties ran north along the Ohio River rather than south toward Richmond. When Virginia voted to secede in 1861, many western counties rejected the decision outright. Local leaders convened their own conventions, declared Virginia's secession illegal, and formed a rival pro-Union government. Backed by Lincoln's administration, they argued that loyalty to the Union outweighed loyalty to the state itself. As the war raged on, this fractured region took a step no American state had taken before. In 1863, Congress approved the creation of West Virginia, a new state carved directly out of Confederate territory. Nevada's admission was driven by wartime strategy. Its immense silver deposits were crucial to Union finances, and Washington was determined to secure control over the region. Despite having a small population and only a brief territorial history, Nevada was fast-tracked into the Union in 1864 with the proud motto "Battle Born." By 1865, the tide of the war had turned. Union generals Ulysses S. Grant in the East and William Tecumseh Sherman in the Deep South applied relentless pressure. Grant pinned down Robert E. Lee's army in Virginia, while Sherman marched across Georgia, destroying Confederate infrastructure and breaking the South's ability to fight. After a long siege around Richmond and Petersburg, Lee's forces collapsed. On April 9, 1865, at Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered to Grant, effectively ending the Civil War. But the political story did not end there. Lincoln intended a relatively moderate, rapid process to bring Southern states back into the Union. But just 5 days after Lee's surrender, he was assassinated. Before his death, however, Lincoln had already pushed the nation toward a permanent break with slavery. In January 1865, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, and by December 1865, it had been ratified by the states, formally abolishing slavery across the entire United States. Vice President Andrew Johnson took over and attempted his own version of Reconstruction, allowing Southern states to reform their governments quickly as long as they ratified the 13th Amendment. By 1866, many former Confederate states had technically been readmitted, but they passed harsh black codes that attempted to preserve slavery in everything but name. Congress responded by taking control of Reconstruction, forcing Southern states to draft new constitutions, guarantee equal rights, and accept federal oversight. Between 1867 and 1870, each state was gradually readmitted under these stricter requirements, culminating with Georgia's final readmission in 1870. Attention then turned back to organizing the vast interior of the continent. Railroads pushed westward, homesteaders poured onto the plains, and territories that had once been crossed only by migrants now needed permanent political structures. One of the first to reach that point was Nebraska. Originally organized under the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, the territory became a crucial corridor for westward movement, crossed by the Oregon, California, and Mormon trails, and anchored by farming communities along the Platte River. Nebraska remained loyal to the Union during the Civil War, and continued settlement and railroad construction quickly strengthened its economy and institutions. With a stable territorial government and sufficient population, Nebraska entered the Union in 1867. West of Nebraska, the frontier rose into the Rocky Mountains. Colorado's path to statehood was shaped by war and minerals. Gold discoveries in the late 1850s triggered a rush into the Central Rockies, drawing settlers into a region that had previously been split among several territories. When the Civil War erupted in 1861, Washington moved quickly to organize the Colorado Territory, ensuring Union control over its gold fields and mountain passes. Though Confederate forces attempted to push north from New Mexico, they were turned back, securing the region for the Union. Over the following decade, mining towns grew into permanent settlements, railroads linked the Rockies to the rest of the country, and territorial institutions took hold. By 1876, Colorado had the population and political stability Congress required, and it was admitted as a state exactly 100 years after the Declaration of Independence, earning the nickname the Centennial State. After that, the rapid spread of railroads, homesteading, and western migration reshaped the remaining territories. The northern plains, once sparsely settled, filled with farms, ranches, and growing railroad towns. The Dakota Territory became increasingly unmanageable as one unit. Its northern and southern regions developed different economies, political priorities, and centers of power. Local leaders demanded separate representation, and in 1889, Congress approved the division. North Dakota and South Dakota entered the Union together that year, each with stable governments and clear support for statehood. Farther west, mining booms transformed the northern Rockies. Gold, silver, and copper strikes drew waves of prospectors and built towns almost overnight. By the late 1880s, Montana had established cities, a functioning territorial legislature, and the economic base needed to stand on its own. Congress admitted it as a state in 1889. On the Pacific coast, the Washington Territory had evolved into a major regional center. Logging, fishing, and maritime trade drove its growth, while Seattle's rise as a port strengthened its political influence. After adopting a state constitution, and demonstrating long-term stability, Washington also joined the Union in 1889. The inland Northwest followed soon after. Development in the Idaho Territory, from mining camps to agricultural settlements and new rail links, created the institutional strength and political cohesion Congress looked for. Idaho was admitted in 1890. That same year, Wyoming entered under unusual circumstances. Its population was still small, but it had a well-organized territorial government, a strong ranching economy, and a constitutional convention that refused to compromise on women's suffrage, a right women had held there since 1869. Congress ultimately accepted the Constitution as it was, making Wyoming the first state where women could vote from day one. In the Southwest, Utah's quest for statehood had stretched across half a century. Mormon pioneers had settled the region in the late 1840s, but political disputes with Washington, especially over polygamy, repeatedly stalled progress. When the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints formally renounced the practice in 1890, the biggest obstacle disappeared. With a stable territorial government and a rapidly expanding population, Utah was finally admitted in 1896. The last major frontier on the plains was Indian Territory, home to native nations the U.S. had forcibly relocated earlier in the century. For decades, it functioned as a separate political space, but federal land allotment policies, railroad expansion, and increasing white settlement steadily eroded tribal sovereignty. By the early 1900s, Washington pushed for consolidation. In 1907, Oklahoma, combining Oklahoma Territory with most of Indian Territory, entered the Union. The continental map neared completion with New Mexico and Arizona in 1912. Both territories had been part of the United States since 1850, but rugged landscapes, slow development, and political resistance in Congress delayed their admission. Over time, mining, ranching, irrigation projects, and expanding railroads built the foundations for statehood. After drafting acceptable constitutions and proving their long-term viability, New Mexico joined in January 1912, followed by Arizona in February, completing the modern outline of the continental United States. Far up in the northern corner of America, Alaska had been under U.S. control since 1867, when the United States purchased it from the Russian Empire for $7.2 million. At the time, critics dismissed the deal as Seward's folly, arguing that Secretary of State William H. Seward had traded millions for a frozen emptiness. But the territory proved far more valuable than anyone expected. Its salmon fisheries became one of the most productive in the world, fueling canneries, new ports, and trade routes along the Pacific. The discovery of gold, first in the 1880s and then on a massive scale during the Klondike and Nome rushes of the 1890s, brought tens of thousands of miners, merchants, and adventurers north. Entire towns rose from the wilderness, rail lines and shipping networks expanded, and Alaska became increasingly tied into the broader American economy. Its strategic importance emerged even more dramatically during World War II, when Japanese forces invaded and occupied Attu and Kiska in the Aleutian Islands in 1942. The U.S. military poured troops, airfields, and infrastructure into the region. Alaska suddenly became a front line of national defense. After the war, Alaskans argued, convincingly, that they had sacrificed and contributed on the same level as any state. They paid federal taxes, served in the armed forces, and supported national industries, yet lacked full representation in Congress. By the 1950s, the territory had a stable civilian government, growing cities like Anchorage and Fairbanks, and major Cold War military installations. With bipartisan support building in Washington, Congress approved the Alaska Statehood Act, and in January 1959, Alaska became the 49th state. Deep in the Pacific, Hawaii's path could not have been more different. For most of the 19th century, Hawaii was an independent kingdom recognized by major world powers. But its economy grew increasingly dependent on sugar exports controlled by wealthy American planters who held enormous influence over land, labor, and trade. By the 1880s, these businessmen pushed for greater political power. They backed the Bayonet Constitution of 1887, which they forced upon King Kalakaua under threat of violence. It stripped the monarchy of much of its authority and effectively handed political control to the planter elite, many of whom were not native Hawaiians. When Queen Liliuokalani came to the throne in 1891, she attempted to reverse this erosion of sovereignty. She drafted a new constitution to restore voting rights to native Hawaiians and reduce foreign control. For the planters, this was unacceptable. Fearing both economic losses and the return of Hawaiian political autonomy, they organized a Committee of Safety, a small group of American businessmen who openly planned to remove the Queen. In January 1893, they acted. Backed by U.S. Minister John L. Stevens and Marines from the USS Boston, they moved to remove Queen Liliuokalani from power. To avoid bloodshed in Honolulu, the Queen surrendered under protest, trusting that the United States would later correct what she believed was an illegal overthrow. Instead of restoration, the conspirators proclaimed a provisional government that soon declared itself the Republic of Hawaii and pushed for annexation. President Grover Cleveland condemned the overthrow as unlawful and ordered the Blount Report, which confirmed that the monarchy had been toppled with American assistance. But the planter government refused to relinquish power, and Washington's resolve weakened. In 1895, supporters of the Queen attempted a counter-revolution. When it failed, the Republic responded with force. Liliuokalani was arrested, stripped of her authority, and confined inside Iolani Palace, her own home, under armed guard. Her personal papers were seized, her lands claimed, and hundreds of Hawaiians were jailed. To secure the release of her supporters and prevent further executions, she was coerced into signing a formal abdication. With resistance crushed and the monarchy dismantled, strategic concerns took over. As the Spanish-American War approached, American leaders saw Hawaii as indispensable to Pacific defense. In 1898, the United States annexed the islands through the Newlands Resolution, ending Hawaiian sovereignty and turning the former kingdom into an American territory. As a territory, Hawaii expanded quickly. Plantations grew, ports modernized, and massive military bases emerged. The attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 highlighted just how central the islands were to American defense. By the 1950s, Hawaii had a large population, a stable government, and strong local support for statehood. Despite lingering debates in Congress over culture, distance, and the ethics of the 1893 overthrow, the political consensus shifted. Hawaii was admitted as the 50th state in August 1959. With Alaska and Hawaii, the modern United States, from 13 colonies to 50 states, was complete.